This is Paul Moon, director of the documentary Samuel Barber, Absolute Beauty, and you're listening to the fourth episode of what has become an occasional podcast series in the film's afterlife. I've called it Capricorn Conversations to focus on some more American musicians and composers connected with that era of American music, who would have fit right into conversations at that house named Capricorn, where Barber and Menotti lived, famous as a crossroads of 20th century composers. I'm sitting here with Howard Pollack in Brooklyn, whose new book about Samuel Barber is coming soon. Howard, thanks for giving us a preview of your research.
Oh, you're very welcome.
So you've arrived at Samuel Barber, and it's after an accomplished career already writing about many major American composers. As a way of us getting acquainted with that body of work that leads into Samuel Barber in the latest work, I just thought it'd be interesting to run down some of these books you've written and circle back to Barber.
Pretty much all of my books are life and work studies. My first book was pretty much a revision of my dissertation, very much like Barbara Hayman revising her dissertation for her excellent Barber biography on the American composer Walter Piston, and that seemed to set the path for me doing a lot of research in mid-century American composers. And then I went on to write a follow-up study of composers who had studied with him at Harvard. I went back in time a little bit to write a biography of John Alden Carpenter, who was a Chicago composer whose heyday was the 1910s and 1920s. It's interesting that interviewed late in his life, he says something to the effect of Samuel Barber, who was a much younger composer than he was, but Samuel Barber sort of continuing along the lines that he himself was pioneering. So maybe that was a little forewarning that I'd wind up writing about Barber. But in the meantime, I went on to write a life and work study of Aaron Copland, then George Gershwin, then Mark Blitzstein, a very good theater and opera composer. Many people associate his name especially with The Cradle Will Rock, which actually became the subject of a wonderful Tim Robbins film about the premiere of The Cradle Will Rock in the 1930s, directed by the opera. It is really an opera. The opera was directed by Orson Welles and produced by John Houseman. Has a great history, very famous history. And Tim Robbins made a rather riveting film about the premiere of that piece. And then John Latouche, who is a lyricist and librettist. The history of that book for me is a little interesting. There were a number of composers, after I had finished Blitzstein, there were a number of composers I considered writing about and researching. Barber and Menotti were always in the back of my mind. I was very aware of them, but I went in some other directions. And there were various composers, again, of the mid-century, which is an era that I feel very close to, that I was interested in studying, including Vernon Duke, Duke Ellington, Leonard Bernstein, Jerome Morris, Douglas Moore. The reason I mention those particular composers is that I found that John Latouche had worked with all of them. And it made me wonder, what was it about him that would attract so many sophisticated composers who were interested particularly in reaching a large audience and writing for Broadway? So, and then I thought it would be fun to follow a lyricist around instead of a composer, which was my usual way of doing things. So here I am, book number 8, and it's a study of Samuel Barber.
And these intersections are something that I'm going to really enjoy hearing more about, because that is sort of the gold for a biographer too, because you start to see how these intersections trace back to certain sources. I thought I'd just jump right in. There's so much we can talk about, but I have always wondered a lot about Scalero, who was the composition teacher of Barber, And you're in the academic world. I mean, to fully introduce you, you're a professor at the University of Texas in Houston, I believe it is.
University of Houston.
University of Houston, thanks. And so in that academic world, it's the same sort of environment where you have teachers, teaching their students, but with much discipline and order and expectation. And so the caricature of Scalero is somebody who was sort of a conservative teacher stuck in the past, perhaps, and so on. But when I was reading some excerpts from your writings, it sounds like it's a little less dramatic than that, that actually he had a great relationship on the whole with Barber and Menotti, and that also he taught some of these other composers you've mentioned, and quite a few more that people have heard a lot about. So it's an odd place to start, I'm sure, but I'd love to hear more about Scalero so that I'm able to rethink my caricature of Scalero.
I think it's a very natural place to begin because a composer's education is so fundamental and formative. And because I've spent so much time in mid-century, and a number of my subjects studied with Nadia Boulanger, who was the foremost teacher of composers of this period, I breathed a sigh of relief that actually Barber hadn't studied with Nadia Boulanger, because one thing I don't like to do is constantly be backtracking and have to once again explain who Nadia Boulanger was. She was the teacher of Piston, Walter Piston, and she taught many of his students. The second book that I wrote, Harvard Composers, many of those students who studied with Piston at Harvard, like Elliott Carter and Irving Fine and others, proceeded to study with Nadia Boulanger. And Copeland had studied with Nadia Boulanger. And Mark Blitzstein had studied with Nadia Boulanger. So in all these books, I'm faced with the challenge of how am I going to introduce Nadia Boulanger to my readers without repeating myself? Because I just hate to do that.
And that's not to mention big marquee names of the later generations like Philip Glass and Quincy Jones.
Absolutely, absolutely. So now in the case of Scalero, Mark Blitzstein had studied with Scalero too. In fact, Mark Blitzstein and Samuel Barber were at the Curtis Institute at the same time. And you couldn't really imagine more different people. You had Mark Blitzstein, son of Jewish immigrants, eventual member of the Communist Party, writing very political works. And then you have Samuel Barber, very mainline, Philadelphia, patrician, genteel, rather apolitical, liberal in his politics, but, not preoccupied with a political agenda the way Blitzstein was. One of the things that was interesting to me regarding that is, though they obviously knew each other from an early age, in fact, they were one of the very few composers that took also a seminar with Deems Taylor while they were at Curtis. That was maybe the only other composition teacher, really, that Barber studied with. They had one semester, and I think actually he only took it for a few weeks, and then he dropped out because he was commuting from Westchester, if I have the story correct. But so they knew each other, but no contact. They moved in different circles. I'm sure they ran into each other from time to time. They were both good friends with Aaron Copland and Leonard Bernstein. Leonard Bernstein was a tremendous champion of Blitzstein. He even named his children after characters in Blitzstein's operas. I mean, that's how close Bernstein was to Blitzstein. But I didn't see any connections. The only connection I found was after Mark Blitzstein was murdered in Martinique, tragically, of course. Barber made a contribution to the Mark Blitzstein Memorial Fund. I was very intrigued with that. It was the one little piece of evidence that suggested that Blitzstein was on Barber's radar. Though I'm sure Menotti and Barber, Menotti, of course, being a great theater man, recognized Blitzstein as one of the other great theater men of that period. And Blitzstein actually does write some very insightful critiques of Menotti's operas. And there's some aspects of Vanessa that I think might have drawn on Mark Blitzstein's Regina, an opera that played on Broadway in about 8 years prior. So yes, I'm interested in those connections. The most puzzling of these connections, and I will get back to Rosario Scalero. I know you asked me about him. The most puzzling is John Latouche, because John Latouche was one of the central figures in the artistic world of New York in the 1940s and 1950s. His home was a hub of all the theater and music people. It was a little bit more in the direction of Broadway, but they had very, very close mutual friends, Barber and Latouche. Gore Vidal and Jane and Paul Bowles, many others, Copeland, and yet I could find no evidence of any interaction between Latouche and Barber and Menotti. It would be wonderful if I would be able to ask them today about that. And this is one of the problems of now studying mid-century. With the passage of time, there are fewer and fewer people alive that you can actually interview and ask questions, to interview. One of the things I'm so indebted to Barbara Heyman for is that she, of course, has devoted a lifetime to the study of Barber, and she began quite early in this process and was able to interview a number of people who have since died. And it's one of the things that makes her book so valuable. But getting back to Rosario Scalero for just a minute. So I did discuss Rosario Scalero in my Blitzstein book. But the relationship of Blitzstein and Scalero compared to Barber and Scalero is like night and day. In fact, it's almost night and day for anyone who went through Curtis and studied with Scalero, except for perhaps Menotti, who also had a very, very close relationship with Scalero. But it's rather astonishing that Samuel Barber studied with Rosario Scalero for some 8 years, 8 of the 9 years that he spent at Curtis. That is very unusual for any composer to study so long with one teacher. And some of the other students who did study with Scalero would go off and study with Nadia Boulanger. Mark Blitzstein, for instance, he went on and studied not only with Nadia Boulanger, but he studied with Arnold Schoenberg in Berlin. So he was hitting 3 of the major pedagogues and teachers of that period. Barber felt he could get everything he needed from Rosario Scalero. And that's the only situation that comes to mind comparable that I could think of, but I'm sure there are others, is the lengthy apprenticeship of Alban Berg with Arnold Schoenberg. It was also a very, very long period that he studied with Schoenberg. But that closeness is especially unusual in that Scalero, unlike Schoenberg, was rather unsympathetic to contemporary trends, to contemporary musical trends. His musical taste went about as far as Respighi, not too much further than that. And so that was one of the reasons why many other of his students felt they wanted to study with Hindemith or Schoenberg or Boulanger and get more familiar with modern styles. It was enough for Barber to be able to get the skills, the techniques, the craftsmanship based on very old methods of musical composition. It was enough for him to do that without and then finding his own modernist style pretty much on his own. I sometimes wonder if one of the reasons he might not have considered studying with Boulanger is he didn't want to be pushed too far in that direction of, for instance, Stravinsky. She was a great advocate of Stravinsky's music. Not that Barber, was not influenced by Stravinsky, but certainly not to the extent that Copland or Blitzstein or Piston were.
So the role of a composition teacher can be the fundamentals that are sort of the precedent of music theory, but they could also be drawing out of the composer some innate style, idiom. What do you think? There was a bit of butting heads, wasn't there? I think you quote a famous confrontation where I think it was after the piano sonata, where Barber began to say, well, things must change. Modern music was beginning to enter into Barber's catalog with that piece in particular. How was that a battle of two minds, or was it just a truce?
It was not easy for anyone to study with Scalero. Composers who were coming to him thinking they were going to write their own sort of chamber piece or song were quickly disabused of that idea. He would tell them, you know nothing. We are going to start with note-by-note counterpoint. We are going to start from the beginnings. This came as a kind of a shock to Nino Rota, the great Italian film composer, who came to Curtis with a lot of education, a lot of, I think he'd worked with Alfredo Casella back in Italy, and he came and he lasted in Curtis for 3 semesters. I mean, he was not going to subject himself to that sort of very academic training. And even in the Curtis catalog, it says something like, at a certain point, composers might be able to write works in their own modern idiom, but in the meantime, you need to learn the ropes. And if you look at the works in the time of Barber, the works that Scalero students perform, the works that were performed in concert at Curtis, they all have titles like Chorale Prelude, Prelude and Fugue, these very academic forms. Now, eventually, if you really got became fluent in 18th and 16th century counterpoint, he allowed you to write perhaps a sonata in the style of Brahms or influence a Brahmsian sonata of some sort. And that was about as far as you could go. And in fact, we can see the very last pieces that Barber wrote at Curtis, the overture to the School of Scandal, the cello sonata,
which he dedicated to Scalero, didn't he?
The
cello
sonata,
yeah.
And Dover Beach. We can see them very much as graduation pieces. They're still kind of the end of the pedagogical training was to write these kind of Brahmsian pieces, and then Barber leaves Curtis, and he really begins to spread his wings and goes his own way. And of course, by the time we get to the piano sonata, which you were referring to before, and he shows it to Rosario Scalero, he's gone quite a distance from School of Scandal and School for Scandal. And so Rosario Scalero didn't particularly give his full endorsement of the piece.
I saw you quoting Virgil Thomson, sort of pitting Scalero against Boulanger.
Yes.
Saying, well, between the two of them, we have to admit, almost begrudgingly, that Scalero was perhaps the better composing teacher.
I think he says something like Scalero was more tolerant of 1/6/4 chords, or something very, very minor.
That too.
Saying essentially they got similar trainings by Boulanger, but they were very, very different pedagogues. Boulanger really drew out of her students, many of her American students, the idea. She used to say that American music was about to take off the way Russian music took off in the 19th century. She had this certain historical vision of American music as something very distinctive, and she encouraged her students to draw on the vernacular, on their youth in America, and in the case of that early generation of Copland, that would have been maybe jazz or blues, and draw from that. And that was something of a revelation so it was a combination of that old fashioned pedagogy, but new thinking about new styles of music, whereas Scalero is a universalist in his thinking. He's not thinking the destiny of American music. He's thinking about Goethe and Michelangelo and the ancient Greeks and the universal values of art, and that alone explains something of the difference between Copland and Barber. They each one of them imbibe from these very important pedagogues a different aesthetic, a different sensibility.
It's so interesting because it's across the pond. I mean, you have Boulanger sort of romanticizing this folk America. But then in your book, you note that Barber probably couldn't have cared less about the American West, and that he was facing Europe always. His heart was in the Western civilization that is, so to speak, classical in nature.
Absolutely. I think he's one of the most surprising things of his that I think I read was that Herman Melville was the only American artist that he felt close to. Though he was actually a great admirer of Henry James. He owned the complete New York edition of all those Henry James novels, and of course Henry James is the epitome of the transatlantic artist who's looking back and forth to America, to Europe, with the international theme, and but yes, Barber is deeply, deeply involved in the European Western tradition.
Yeah. I'm still thinking about this Western motif and the way that Copland, of course, is so well known, perhaps too well known for some of his Western theme pieces. It's almost as if Barber might have privately not been too interested in that, although there's a photograph of a Yestern scene, so still reluctant to even call it the West.
Uh-huh. The quote that you're referring to, I have two comments to make to that, to your commentary. One is that Menotti says something rather odd about Barber. He says he didn't care about the West. He just cared about New England. He thought New England was the real America. I think that's the quote that you're referring to. And yet Barber writes Knoxville Summer of 1915, which is, a heartland piece, if there ever was a heartland piece. And the moral of that is that Menotti isn't always the most reliable spokesman for Barber, though we're dependent on things Menotti says because Menotti said a lot more than Barber did. Barber kept his cards very close to his vest, and Menotti was more, voluble and as far as that was concerned. But the other point I wanted to make in your interesting comparison about Copland and Barber, and of course I could go on about that comparison for forever practically, but Copland is really more of an urban composer. He made his reputation basically as a composer whose music evoked the skyscrapers of New York and the urban bustle of New York. And Barber goes on record in the 1930s of saying skyscrapers has nothing to do with my music. And he always talked about how important the countryside was for him. So you have this kind of opposition of the very urban composer, very pastoral composer. Now, how does that play in with these Western ballets of Copland? Well, there is a pastoral element to them for sure. But when you look at something like Billy the Kid, we have to remember, the Wild West of the 1890s or the late 19th century was also part of the Industrial Revolution. There were railroads, there were pistols, and Copland brings a kind of a modernist sensibility to his portrayal of the West. It's not shepherds, in ancient Greece with their panpipes or something like that. And talking about shepherds, there's something like, Barber's the Coulin, which is, this wonderful Irish text about, shepherd out in the hills in Ireland. So, lots of difference between them, though they did become friends. And they did have, they mutually admired one another, though it was a difficult relationship, as many relationships with composers were for Barber. And I can talk about that if you might be interested.
Well, I think it's always an interesting exercise to place oneself in a different time and to think about the tastes of the time. So I would say this big pause we just had, we've been suffering through the past year. One of the things, as a new New Yorker myself, I think about what does Broadway mean, and the return of Broadway, and that sort of unique American art form, if you will. And so one thing that fascinates me, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, or what you uncovered during your research, is if we had the benefit of hearing Samuel Barber comment on the emerging art form of the Broadway musical, even though an important sort of clarification or qualifier on that is maybe Broadway was different then than it is now. But even between Menotti and Barber, you had Menotti exploring the world of Broadway, a place that was putting on operas, but still, I don't want to use the word erosion of Scalero's conservative compositional techniques, but something different, if I may just leave it at that. So I kind of wonder whether Barber, well, first of all, what would we guess Barber would say about someone like Leonard Bernstein? It's interesting, when you were talking about the urban dynamism that you can hear in music, I think of Copland indeed, and I think especially of Leonard Bernstein, such a city guy, such a person who represented, the majesty of the city and the dynamism of his music. So Barber, how did he fit into that world, or does that explain why he didn't fit into that world?
I think it explains a little bit of both. He did become good friends with Leonard Bernstein, and there are some hilarious stories about Bernstein and Barber. One is, I'm going to have to paraphrase this, but one is that...
As far as you want to go.
Okay. Well,
and by the way, this interests me a lot, because there's a part of me that always wondered whether there was a rivalry, or whether there could have been a rivalry. I start the documentary, actually, with Leonard Bernstein saying that there was always something that he admired about Barber, and it turns into the title of the film, Absolute Beauty, because there's an absolute, even classical Greek kind of quality, Platonic quality to Barber's music that perhaps Leonard Bernstein felt. We know that Leonard Bernstein struggled with his identity as a, quote, serious composer. So I guess that's what I'm driving at with all these questions about Broadway. It wasn't a completely different world than the world of classical music and opera, but Bernstein was caught between the identity crisis of being taken seriously as a composer in the way that Scalero would expect his students to write music, and the populism of these wonderful musicals like West Side Story.
Barber is a little different in that many composers of this period did aspire to the new forms of film and the Broadway musical, or Broadway, as you say, in some fashion or other, and that would include Blitzstein and, Copland and Leonard Bernstein. Leonard Bernstein can be very much seen, actually, as very in the tradition of Copland and Blitzstein. Those are his two mentors in many ways. So yes, this this New York, get right in the midst of the new technology, the new media, the new everything, television, Leonard Bernstein going under. Barber's a very reserved figure and had very little interest in popular music, it seems, and the Broadway musical and film music. I mean, the irony is that, of course, his music is tremendously dramatic, and film composers have used Barber's music up and down. And he could have perhaps had a film career of some sort, but he actually goes on record as saying it takes too much of a composer's freedom away. Personal freedom, individuality, this is so important to Barber. And I don't think he was the sort of team player that you need for Broadway or film.
And when you have a strong character like Zeffirelli, and already you see the makings of a conflict.
Exactly. And that's what made, it a little bit difficult for him to even work in the operatic world. Of course, with Vanessa and A Hand of Bridge, he's working with Menotti. And he's working with somebody who's prepared to revere him. With Antony and Cleopatra, it's a little bit more challenging, or a lot more challenging.
I'd love to hear. By the way, I really do want to hear the Bernstein story. So
okay.
we got to get there. But since you went on this detour that I actually am very passionate about, film. It's a healthy, or not a healthy, I should say. It's a intriguing question, because a lot of great classical composers, Hollywood came calling and they answered the call. And so you have examples, of course, like Bernard Herrmann, a really solid composer who pretty much became known as a film composer. I think Barber was already quite a rock star of his time anyways. He didn't need Hollywood the way that some of these, for heaven's sake, I think Bernard Herrmann was running away from something in addition to anything else. But why it's interesting to analyze what makes a good film score. And then it's an interesting question to ask, why would Barber's music work or not work with a Hollywood movie?
Well, I would refer your listeners to your interview with John Masseri, who really spoke to this very issue about film composers. Again, I think writing a film score requires a lot of collaboration, a lot of teamwork. And Barber is somebody, and I think this goes really profoundly to his essence, is very interested in his individuality, self-expression, expressing who he is. Many people, even when they look at the texted works of Barber, and of course he's considered the greatest American composer of vocal music. I don't think there's any question about that, though Copland's 12 Poems of Emily Dickinson is another great masterpiece in that genre. But Copland didn't, there's that famous quote in that interview with Philip Ramey when he says, people like Copland and Piston and Sessions weren't really lyrical composers anyway, and didn't write much vocal music. I'm bisexual. I do both. I don't know if you remember that quote in that Philip Ramey interview. But over the years, many people have been troubled by his settings. They find that he's not reflecting their reading of the text, that he's imposing his own personality so strongly on the text it becomes something else. And either you're going to like it or not. You're going to go with it or you're not. When you listen to Copland's Emily Dickinson songs, it's as if Emily Dickinson herself is speaking. And I think that kind of relates in a way to Copland's ability to be such a good film composer. Copland was a superb film composer. Virtually all his films, there weren't that many, he just wrote a handful of film scores, but nearly all of them were nominated for Academy Awards, which he won with The Heiress. That was a great achievement.
And Our Town is just so wonderful.
Yeah. But, another motivation, and this comes into play, is that a lot of those composers in the 1930s, for either political reasons or very often for financial reasons, wanted to write film because it was the Depression and money was tight and they could go out in Hollywood. Copland did that. He'd go out to Hollywood, he'd score a film, then come back to New York and write a chamber work. It got him through a very difficult period because Copland actually made virtually very little money in the first practically 40 years of his life. But Barber had the support of Mary Bach And, it was like,
Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge.
yeah, he was getting commissions. He was getting, a Barber with Copeland, Piston, Blitzstein, Sessions. They were all scrambling to get their music published by these niche publishers like Cobb and the Arrow Press. And Barber, at a very young age, snags this contract with G. Schirmer, and he has G. Schirmer going to bat for him. And he has Toscanini and and he's still in his mid-20s. And he has Rodzinski and Ormandy and Toscanini and Kusevitsky and all these people playing his music. And so there's not the same maybe incentive and need to go out to Hollywood. And he doesn't like California either, but I don't think any of these composers really like Los Angeles that much.
Well, and actually to circle back to Bernstein, remind me, I'm sure there's a lot of details to it, but in a nutshell, Bernstein did have pretty much one bad experience writing an incidental music score, and that was on The Waterfront. So that didn't go well, did it?
I don't know the history of that.
It's pretty bad. In other words, he wrote more material than was used in the film. He lost control. It just was something where he was expected as a sort of a contract worker to fill in the blanks.
Well, knowing the film score as I do, I can see that because it's a very, one might even say, one might say overwritten, but it's certainly a very prominent film score that grabs your attention. Copeland used to say a good film score does not grab your attention. A good film score, you shouldn't be aware of a film score. It should be sort of in the background and creating the mood and not interrupting your interaction with the drama and with the characters. So Bernstein may have been too strong a personality to subject himself to those type of restrictions and limitations.
So let's set the stage. Bernstein doesn't overlap with Barber actually at Curtis. In fact, that's a late career move for Bernstein to go to Curtis, focusing on his conducting, learning more conducting with a teacher there. But yes, to the extent you can tell us any stories of interactions between Barber and Bernstein, that would be new to me.
Well, they did get to know each other early on, and Barber takes a real interest in Bernstein when Bernstein is really quite young, and their worlds overlap because it's the world of Kusevitsky and Copeland, and so they get to know each other. And Barber writes some rather warm, unusually warm letters, because Barber was not kind of a warm and fuzzy type, but he really writes this kind of very warm, endearing letter to Bernstein about, maybe we can be friends. And he really appreciated, and of course he was dazzled by Bernstein's talent, like everybody was, very quickly. Bernstein maybe did not, in the long run, play as much Barber as Barber might have wanted him to play. He was very sensitive about that sort of thing. And because certainly Bernstein played a lot more Copeland than he did Barber, though he did perform a number of the works over the years and, of course, performed them brilliantly. But the story that I was alluding to, well, there's two stories. One is they find themselves on Martha's Island in 1959, and they say, let's have dinner every night. And Barbara says something to the effect of, after a week, I said to Felicia, Bernstein's wife, I think, we've had enough. And she said, yes, I think we have. There's some sort of story to that effect. The other anecdote, I forget the source, but it may be Charles Turner, but there was one interaction between Barber and Bernstein about the same time. It may have happened during this summer of 1959, where Bernstein, and they were both difficult people. I mean, Bernstein and Barber, wow. I'd like to be in the room to see that interaction. But Barber was kind of confrontational, said, "You don't like me very much, do you?" And Barber said, "Actually, I like Felicia 100%, but I only like you 75%. And Bernstein says to him, "Well, why is that?" And he said, because many years ago, like 20 years ago, you sat down at a party after the performance of my violin concerto and you started to play the opening of the music, and you played a wrong note in the opening measure. I mean, Barbara could really hold on to these petty grudges for forever, really. And Bernstein at that sits down at the piano and plays the opening of the violin concerto perfectly. And he says, "Is that any better?" And Barbara says, "Now I like you 76%.
Oh, wow. That's cruel. That's a tough.
Oh, you had to have a pretty thick skin to hang out with Barbara.
Yeah, let's talk about that. I mean, I kind of, again, in this little exercise of, I say placing myself back in the era and the attitudes and the tolerance or acceptance of new forms of music. Similarly, I just kind of always wonder, especially we're talking about Capricorn. Let's say there's a gathering at the house. I don't want to use the word alpha, beta, or anything like that, but what does Barber look like in a room full of composers? In other words, is he actually introverted, or is he a much more, dynamic and outgoing person than his music would suggest?
Well, the typical portrayal of Barber, let's say, not at home for a minute. Let's set this up. And he's at a cocktail party, typical for in the music world of Manhattan. And Menotti is going around working the room, talking to everybody, just charming, amusing, delightful. And Barber is in a corner with that frozen smile that his nephew and others have talked about, the frozen smile, looking absolutely terrified and bored, as somebody has just kind of pinned him against the wall, and he just wants to be anywhere else but that party. That's kind of the typical dynamic of Menotti and Barber, kind of in certain circles. But if he's comfortable, if he's at home or abroad, he's with Steven Spender in London, or if he's with his Suso Cecchi in Italy, and he's with friends, he's the life of the party. And he's delightful, and he's funny, and he's telling jokes. So it really depended on the dynamic of the social situation where he's in. But even in Capricorn, I mean, there's a story, I think it's in the Menotti, John Gruhn's Menotti biography, where I think Tallulah Bankhead, who was of course, very prominent actress of the era, was a neighbor at Mount Kisco at Capricorn. And she came over once with her sister Eugenia, and apparently, the story goes, Barber didn't like Eugenia at all, and he locks himself in the bathroom and Menotti said we had to get food through the window in the bathroom because he wouldn't come out of the bathroom until she left. So make what you will of that.
I hope I don't get this wrong, but it was actually just earlier today that also somebody was talking about Charles Ives. And apparently there's some story about them having the car all packed and ready to go on a trip somewhere where they were going to socialize with some people. And Barber found out that Charles Ives was going to be in the mix. And for some sort of, objection to Charles Ives of one kind or another, he unpacked the car and said, "I'm not going."
Well, the story I know, which is a related story, concerns one afternoon at Tanglewood, which, because Barber loathed the music of Charles Ives. He thought this was the work of an amateur, a hack. And he says that he's attending a talk of Copland's or a composition seminar at Tanglewood, and Copland, this is in the late 40s, and he says Copland announces that Ives is a great American composer, and Barber says something, and this is in an interview, and Barber says something to the effect of, and I got up and I went out and I got in my car and I drove away.
I think this is the same story.
Yeah, it may have been.
It translated wrong back to me, but the point is made, but it's also a little bit annoying, I have to say. And it's interesting how I wonder whether, and this could be, nuances of character flaw, where what is Barber's problem with Ives? There's a part of me that really loves that music, and yet you have a couple of things going on there. You have somebody who embraces American folk music, celebrates it, trying to bring it into the formal concert hall, but also messing around with the rules a little bit here and there. But maybe also it's that, this is not a conservatory trained establishment, composer. This is somebody who sells insurance policies also, Is there an elitism behind that as well that could help also describe barriers to entry in this mid-century era that you've concentrated so much of your research? In other words, there is an abundance of composers today. And so as, I look at all of the intersections of some of these composers that you've studied at such length, but also many more, it still seems like a small little coterie of people, very much concentrated in New York City also. I don't want to say better or worse, but things have changed, haven't they? If you fast forward to 2021.
Well, there are certainly many more composers writing today than there were back then, and probably New York was much more important as a center, whereas probably it's much more decentralized today. So yes, there's that. But there was also a spirit of the time for community, and the organizations that were founded in the 1920s and 30s, like the League of Composers and so forth, and some of these presses like Cobb and Arrow Press, and you had someone like Copland. Copland does play a larger-than-life role in the history of American music, over and beyond the actual accomplishments of his music. He starts the Copland Sessions concerts, for instance. He organizes the Yaddo Festival concerts. He's in charge of the composition department at Tanglewood. He's and then there was Modern Music, the journal Modern Music, in which they all wrote. Now, it's actually surprising that Barber never wrote for Modern Music. That's as indicative of anything of I think Barber's going his own way. But Barber didn't write about music generally. He didn't speak about music very much. It's one of the frustrating things for any Barber scholar is, you wish he lectured more or published more. He didn't really speak about music that much.
Not much interested in being a teacher besides sort of a direct tutelage of Charles Turner, right?
Right. He does. He substitutes a few weeks for Onager. He taught orchestration at Curtis for a few semesters, and he takes over for a few weeks for Onager at Tanglewood, and he makes a big impression on those students. Ned Rorem, William Flanagan. It's one of the things about his legacy that's interesting. Had he taught more, or had he been associated with a university or a college or conservatory, he may have actually had more of an influence in American music than he did. He was just so outside of those worlds, those academic worlds where composers would go and study. And just those 2 weeks at Tanglewood, he makes a profound impression on Daniel Pinkham and Ned Rorem and William Flanagan. It gives you an idea of how influential he could be. Now, there were some Curtis composers that came under the wing of Menotti and Barber, Lee Hoybe, and some others. And then there were some composers that found Barber all on their own, more or less, like John Curliano, for whom Barber is a very important influence. But all these composers, whether it's Ned Rorem or not John Curliano, if you ask them about it, when they were at school, Barber was like a persona non grata. I mean, Curliano talks about how disdainful the faculty and students at Columbia were when he was there. And you hear this story quite a lot.
Well, you've really set up an interesting mystery, because on the one hand, we can say that classical music, that's such a vague categorization, but classical music was literally a commercial property back then. It was, to some extent, a popular music. A lot of people bought records of classical music. It was an industry, right? So the more that something becomes subject to, quote, market forces, that way, true supply and demand, the less it seems to me that academic institutions would wield influence. And yet the other narrative that runs alongside any study of Samuel Barber's music is that he was becoming quickly old-fashioned because of the tidal wave of the Second Viennese School, 12-tone music that was so originating from the academic world, right? Let me put it another way. Once you graduate, you throw your hat in the air and you leave, right? That's my idea of art. And we're talking about something very different here, aren't we?
Well, it's interesting. We've circled around a couple of different aesthetics and points of view in the 20th century because we earlier were talking about these populists, or these people that wanted to write for Broadway. And now we're talking about these academics or the members of the avant-garde who were doing maybe more experimental or more modernist thing. And we can see that Barber doesn't fit into either of those camps.
Okay.
But this is the interesting thing that I don't think people appreciate enough about Barber, is that he does have his ear to the ground. He's not living in the 19th century by any means. I mean, here's somebody who sets Finnegan's Wake to music, you know. He's very au courant and very sophisticated about musical, artistic, literary trends. So what he does, and I think, Barbara Heyman, the end of her book, which I think she read at the, or I know I've read her talk about Barber's conservator. She speaks of him as a conservator. I think what he does is he's very much in tune to this mainstream of classical music. And so what he attempts to do, and he's not the only one by any means, but what he attempts to do is write symphonic music, a chamber music, and operatic music that is in this mainstream, but that incorporates aspects of new colors, new sounds, new harmonies. He himself is in the forefront. You mentioned the 12-tone system. He's actually in the forefront of adopting the 12-tone system in the late 1940s with the piano sonata. I mean, he does it in his own way. He doesn't renounce tonality, but he's absorbing that. He uses electronic instrument in Antony and Cleopatra. And the music is often densely chromatic and densely dissonant. It varies, of course. There's some pieces more accessible than others. But the thing that's also interesting to me about Barber is that his music he does grow and develop as a composer. And in the music of the 1930s, which is some of his most popular music, admittedly, but as he does become more adventurous and more modernist in the 1940s and 50s, as he sometimes begins to lose the larger audience, he gains more followers among the more elite. So these are the tensions that any artist, especially in the 20th and 21st century, has to confront: accessibility versus originality.
Well, since you've mentioned the trajectory of Barber's works and the changes over time, which is an interesting subject to study when you think about a composer's arc. It's an inevitable subject to ask about, sort of, if we divide between pre-Antony and post-Antony. So Antony and Cleopatra is a commission to open the new Metropolitan Opera House, and it's described as somewhat of a failure, though it's worth revisiting as a solid composition. It wasn't something that he just cobbled together. It's a serious, important work in his catalog. But there's a narrative that basically, after Antony's failure, or at least criticisms, that he never really produced much more of value, which is a difficult thing also to substantiate, because we do have great works written after that time. But I'm curious, we have a few factors in play that includes his health, not only from eventually melanoma, but also alcoholism is something that can't be overlooked, and also his relationship with Menotti. So if you have any insights that you found in your research about pre and post, and whether that's even important, or in general, how did his music change?
Well, there are two myths I think I'd like to address in relation to that. The first is this idea that the critical establishment thought Barber was an old-fashioned composer. That just does not bear out. It's true in the 1930s, and it's true at the very end of his life in the late 1970s. But in between, and we're talking the 1940s.
Can you name some works?
Well, there's that whole flap over Toscanini conducting Adagio for strings and essay, and why is Toscanini? Ashley Pettis writes a letter to the New York Times. Why is Toscanini playing this neo-romantic, old-fashioned things when he should be playing Copland in sessions? And there's that type of criticism. That starts to go away, I would say, especially with the violin concerto, certainly the Second Symphony, which he, in later years withdrew, got very good critical response, and the typical critical sound says, "Wow, he's really coming into the 20th century, isn't he?" Capricorn Concerto, the works in the 1940s, elicits a new respect for Barber among elite listeners. And that doesn't really go away. In fact, he wins his first Pulitzer Prize for Vanessa in the late 50s, and then he wins for the piano concerto. He wins in the early 1960s, he wins the Pulitzer Prize, the New York Music Critics Award, and a Grammy Award. And this is the early 60s. This is the period that supposedly Barber is considered an old-fashioned composer, because he's not an old-fashioned composer. He's a new composer, and critics understand that. Now, of course, if it was an avant-garde, someone partial to the avant-garde, they'd say, yes, he's old-fashioned and romantic. But when we're talking about the critical establishment, which is the music critics for the New York Times and the Herald Tribune, and for colleagues like Copland or Piston, he gets, I'm sure Walter Piston, who is, in his own way, a respectably modernist composer, was instrumental in his getting his 1959 honorary doctorate from Harvard University. So talking about academia, Harvard University is giving him an honorary doctorate in 1959. And even at the end of his life, he's getting the American Academy Gold Medal and the Edward McDowell Award. That was in the very last years of his life, the highest awards given to a composer. And the people who were making these decisions were educated, distinguished composers and critics in the community. So that was one myth that I'd like to try to put to rest a little bit, or at least to contextualize it a little bit, that it's not such a black and white situation. The other not black and white situation is the response to Antony and Cleopatra, which Barber himself contributed to the lore and mythology of it by talking about it as such a fiasco and such a disaster. When you really read the reviews, many of the reviewers and critics, and not to mention the audience, you could listen to the tape of the opening of the first performance where it had all these curtain calls and cheers and bravos at the end. The critics recognized this, as many of them did, not all of them, but many of them recognized this as an important and beautiful score. Their biggest complaint was that it was overproduced, and Barbara Heyman and others that you've spoken to, have made that very point. So this is nothing new that I'm reporting. I mean, Barbara Heyman and others know this quite well. But the other thing is, it was under-rehearsed. That's another thing that maybe isn't mentioned too often. They were moving into this new opera house, this huge labyrinthine building that nobody knew where they were going, the hallways. And Rudolph Bing, the impresario, the president of the Metropolitan Opera, is putting on 4 new operas, like in the opening 2 weeks, and including Richard Strauss's Die Frau ohne Schatten, which is another huge opera, and they just didn't have enough rehearsal time. So they barely got through it with the skin of their teeth. They have a dress rehearsal where they can only do the first act, and they have to rehearse till 3 o'clock in the morning or 4 o'clock in the morning. This is just before they're going to open.
And there's a huge new turntable that broke during the production.
There was that. They had these. It was during rehearsal. The turntable broke. It had to be restaged. There were lighting cues that were misfiring.
And there was an imminent strike that was just called off right before the curtain went up.
Yes, there was that as well. There's a wonderful Bell Telephone documentary about the that they did at the time about the production, and you could just see the total chaos. And I think one of the commentators says something like, "Here's Sam Barber wishing he was anywhere else but here."
Well, and I carefully note that there was a subsequent documentary repurposing a lot of that footage that was just called The Opera House. And it emerged from that, the current administration that is continuously stressed about the brand image of the Metropolitan Opera for a lot of good reasons. For example, how much it costs to put on operas and how delicate an institution like that is, such a large institution. But that documentary that tried to revisit opening night, made on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the new Met, was really sort of like paving over the complications of the night with regard to Barber. And, it kind of made me sad, in other words, that there appears to be a sort of, glossing over not only the importance of Barber's score, but also the sensationalism of that night that just completely suffocated the compositional value of what Barber produced for the opening night.
And talking about complications, might I add one other aspect or perspective on this whole matter? And that is Antony and Cleopatra is a very difficult opera. It's based on one of Shakespeare's most complex and most difficult plays. It has something like 42 scenes. It has more scenes than any other Shakespeare play. It covers about a 10 or 11-year time period. If it's not even though many people regard it as one of his towering masterpieces, and the poetry of Antony and Cleopatra is ravishing. And of course, that was what attracted Barber to it. He was, immensely literary, and he appreciated the sheer poetry, how nice it would be to sing this gorgeous, gorgeous poetry. However, if if you saw the whole thing, you would, and you don't know the history of Antony and Cleopatra, you would have a real challenge figuring out what the story is really about. And then you have a Zeffirelli libretto, or Barber was very active on hands in that as well, crafting it. You have a libretto that, of course, being an opera, has to, cut it down to size. And so there's lots of holes in the narrative. You don't have the surtitles in 1966 that you have today. And you have, they brought in Shakespearean actors and coaches to try to get the singers to even understand what they were singing. The language is dense and poetic. So you really need to work at it. But once you do, you find that you're in the presence of a deeply profound and beautiful work. So I hope that eventually there'll be more appreciation. I began this whole project on Barber thinking I was just going to write about Antony and Cleopatra. I had no idea that this project was going to go in all these other directions. But
where are you in the field of opinion about the Juilliard revision? Which I guess I would introduce as saying Menotti sort of tarting it up with a little more romance.
Well, there is more lyricism, and there is that love duet that's added. I have to say, what many people don't appreciate is that people say, well, the love duet is Fletcher and Beaumont. It's not even Shakespeare. Actually, that opening stanza is in Measure for Measure. Fletcher and Beaumont took the text from Shakespeare. So many people say that it's not a Shakespearean text. It is a Shakespearean text. And even if the second stanza might have actually been by Shakespeare too, but certainly the first stanza is. What I feel about, I subscribe to the notion, as Andrew Porter and many other critics do, that it'd be nice to have a third edition of this piece, one that would take the best of what the revision has to offer and that would incorporate some of the things that were taken out of the original.
I see. I thought I'd ask you about something that is automatically more of a question for composers and just so ingrained in the arts in general. And this is really going in a different direction here, but I noticed another common thread or intersection in the other composers and lyricists that you've spent so much time researching about politics. And I don't just mean politics in terms of people running for offices and things like this, but about progressive thought, people who were navigating between the worlds of the performing arts as a separate thing, starting to get involved in things that sometimes got them into trouble, including the communist witch hunts of the mid-century during this period. So first, Barber just stayed out of this, didn't he? What do you see going on there? And actually, is that sort of a good thing?
I don't know if I can say what it would be good or bad. It's different people with different agendas, and but I think just thinking about Antony and Cleopatra, let's say, well, this first of all, the aspect that this opening opera, that Barber insisted on having a black woman be the star of this very important opening. He wanted Leontine. They wanted him to write the opening opera, and he wanted Leontine Price to be starring in it. So, I mean, there's just that alone is interesting. Mm-hmm. Leontine Price wanted another character besides Bess or Aida, that she could be a black woman and not, specifically a black woman. And Cleopatra allowed her that as well. And there is, I'm going to get back to Antony and Cleopatra in Vietnam in a second. So don't let me forget that, because I do want to talk about that. I can't even imagine what kind of connection you can make with that. But before I do that, there's a thread, there's a kind of a cultural, I won't say political, but there's a cultural thread between Medea and Andromache's Farewell and Antony and Cleopatra when you think about it. Because all three stories involve an Eastern woman who is passionate and romantic, kind of subjected by the rationality of the West. That's Medea's story. She was Eastern, and she fell in love with Jason, and he took her back to the West, and then she was sort of abused as an outsider, as a foreigner. We talk about our situation with migrants today. Andromache's Farewell, she was Trojan, Turkish. She was Eastern, conquered by the Greeks. Her son killed, she enslaved. Antony and Cleopatra, Shakespeare's great study of the East versus the West, of passion versus reality. I mean, it's a fantasy East, but it's still these issues of rationality versus passion. And, Shakespearean critics to this day debate whether Shakespeare is sympathetic to Antony and Cleopatra or whether he's sympathetic to Caesar. There's this ambivalence there. I don't think there's any ambivalence in the opera. Barber's heart is with Antony and Cleopatra. He's there with the lovers. So there's that. But about, when the opera opened, there were protesters. There were protesters in the front of Lincoln Center protesting the Vietnam War. the Secretary of Defense, McNamara, was one of the people that was there, and Lady Bird Johnson was there, was very high profile. And they had these signs, and they were, I can't remember what the signs were, but it's, they were protesting the war, but in ways that alluded to the opera. And the thing that, change your tune or sing a different tune or something. And the thing about the military, and I think one of your speakers even spoke about the withdrawal of the Second Symphony having to do with Barber's own hesitance about glorifying military in any way.
Mm-hmm, sure.
And the thing that's so interesting is that he uses part of that Second Symphony
in Antony
and Cleopatra. So it almost brings the soldiery, the commentary about war in the context of war into the contemporary time of the mid 1960s. And Antony and Cleopatra is a make love not war opera and play, if there ever was one.
That's such an interesting connection, and also it's of note if Barber ever repurposes any of his themes, because he was not a composer known for that. He did that very little compared to other composers.
And the Trojan Woman, Euripides' Trojan Woman, which is where he got the text from Andromache's Farewell, which just was almost a rehearsal for Antony and Cleopatra, written a few years earlier, is known as one of the great pacifist, anti-military plays of all time. So Barber's aware of what's going on, but he's channeling those concerns into more universal means rather than a Mark Blitzstein who's going to write something about labor unions or something a little bit more.
Yeah, and of course I phrased it in an awkward way because I said, is this a good thing? I mean, I wasn't, dishing for a value judgment, but rather, no, I did want to hear you describe more, and this is the value of additional scholarship that adds to our understanding of Barber. Even back to his background, I noticed that you provided more context about the place that he came from, the liberalism of his family, the progressive values that he came from. Not all progressive. I mean, Westchester, Pennsylvania, a suburb of Philadelphia, maybe not necessarily a place that was ahead of the curve, but the family stood out in that regard, didn't they?
I'm not sure about the family. I have very little information about that, but certainly Sidney Homer, his uncle, who was very influential, who married into his family and who becomes very important, as Barbara Heyman, discussed with you, becomes a very important influence in his life. He definitely had strong progressive points of view. He writes some songs about the hardships of sweatshop workers, and he has a song about anti-Semitism. He's not Jewish, but he has a song about anti-Semitism in Russia. Late in life, he writes about his admiration for Gandhi and Lenin and Harry Truman, an unusual trio.
I mean, these are great things to hear, because if Barber is sort of dogged with a label that he was a conservative composer, it's a little easy then to confuse that with also being somebody who was socially conservative. And you're painting a somewhat refreshing picture of somebody who wasn't so easily, cannot be so easily described.
Yeah, there's that kind of contradiction. Many of the people on the left in this period, and even later periods, when there's kind of a reaction against the serialism and atonality of high modernism, a lot of people on the left actually gravitate toward more conservative, what we would call conservative means of musical communication to express progressive points of view. There's that kind of contradiction there. It goes both ways.
Mm-hmm. Well, how would you dare to contextualize Barber in the so-called, the moniker that we say American music? So first of all, I'm just curious on the whole whether is the phrase American music even problematic, and what value is there in sort of pitting these composers against each other, if you will, to make those types of value judgments. How do I say this another way? What is Barber's place in the ongoing sort of repertoire that continues to be performed? Of course, we hear the Adagio performed somewhat rather endlessly, but it's always a healthy philosophical question. Will they keep playing this music 100 years from now, and why?
Well, your question reminds me of another anecdote, which I forget who, maybe Philip Ramey told me this, told me this, or I think he may have had it in his autobiography. But there's a story of Samuel Barber being at a dinner party very late in life, and he's told that Virgil Thompson is about to arrive. And he makes his exit, and somebody says to him, "Why are you leaving? Virgil is about to arrive." And Barber says, "And to be told my place in American music? No, thank you."
And Virgil Thompson...
So that puts me on the spot. It's like, oh no, I don't think Samuel Barber wants to hear me pontificate about what his place in American music. There's another thing that's very charming. He's interviewed, your listeners can find this on YouTube. There's that documentary, not a documentary, but there's a little television birthday celebration with James Tocco. And James Tocco is introducing Barber, and he says something like, and I'd like to introduce you to one of our leading American composers. And Barber touches him on the shoulder and says, leading. Very arch. And James Tocco says, correction, leading American composer, not one of the leading, or foremost. I think it may have been foremost, not leading, the foremost American composer. Oh, Barber had a very, good sense of his importance, like Stravinsky did too. So Barber would probably say he was the most important American composer, and people could make actually an argument for it. You can make an argument for Elliott Carter or Charles Ives or Duke Ellington or lots of different people, but people could reasonably make an argument for that. And one of the reasons is because how international his music does travel. It's really quite astonishing. He would have been astonished because so much of that happened after his death in 1981. In the 1980s and 1990s and early 21st century, there is an enormous outpouring of recordings. Almost everything he wrote has been recorded numerous times, and many people say he wrote the greatest American piano sonata, the greatest American piano concerto, the greatest American cello sonata, the greatest American song cycle, hermit songs. Yeah, it goes on and on. The music is very entrenched in the repertoire. Now, whether the classical music tradition is going to survive in another 100 years, that's another question. But as long as it survives, there's going to be, I think, a place for Barber. I think his music has proved that durable. Some of these pieces, like School for Scandal, are now in Dover Beach. They're approaching the 100-year mark, and they're still performed and loved all the time. So it's a great achievement for sure.
And certainly at the personal level, you can't write a book about music if you don't love it yourself. So I'm not going to ask you what your favorite piece is, but something that is interesting is where you started with Barber in terms of hearing his music for the first time or the early times, and sort of where you have ended up by now. What has changed? What was a piece or some of his pieces that first appealed to you? And were there any surprises along the way where you suddenly warmed up to another of Barber's works?
Well, I grew up with that old Thomas Schipper's recording of the all Barber recording, and love pieces like Medea's Meditation and Dance of Vengeance and so forth, and the Piano Sonata. I had an early appreciation for that. I have to say, as somebody so entrenched in neoclassicism and the Boulanger School and Stravinsky, I was a little bit prejudiced against Barber because I saw Barber kind of through their eyes, and I saw him as being very romantic. But as I've gotten to study him more and more, but I mean, over 10 years ago, or maybe 20 years ago, I wrote an article about the First Symphony. I've always been interested in his music and respectful of it, but I didn't know whether it was really my cup of tea per se. But as I've gotten more and more, one of the surprising things is really how much, for instance, in neoclassicism, one of the attractions to me about neoclassicism is the amount of counterpoint you find in these composers' music. And I'm finding, I mean, and this is the fruits of 8 years with Rosario Scalero, the contrapuntal sophistication. Bach became his very favorite composer, and Brahms, these great contrapuntalists and the Renaissance composers were so influential on that aspect of Barber's work. I didn't quite appreciate that. I didn't see past the romanticism to the more intellectual aspects of his music. And so I find that very tantalizing, that he's able to be so lyrical and so appealing on the one hand, but if you get into the music, you will find yourself kind of endlessly fascinated by his by his counterpoint and his orchestration.
That happened to me with the Capricorn Concerto for sure, because it just didn't appeal to me at first because I wanted that soaring melodic line that, you treasure so much from pieces like the Violin Concerto. But it's such a tight and perfect piece in its construction that I don't even understand well as a non-composer. But I just started figuring out or perceiving that there was something very complex and sophisticated happening there, but yet completely under control. Like, not chaotic, but very, very precise.
And there are those like Walter Simmons, who brilliant writer about Barber and other American composers, who sees the Capricorn Concerto and some of the works of the 1940s as kind of a sort of a detour and not really the authentic Barber. It's not his among his favorite Barber pieces, though he's a great admirer of Barber. For me, of course, being attuned to neoclassicism, that was an easy entry for me, is Capricorn Concerto. And Copland performed it quite a lot as a conductor. It was one of his favorite pieces.
Well, in all of this, you didn't mention the Adagio for strings as being the one and only piece that you've ever heard about from Samuel Barber, and that really is where most people are. So I just can't resist asking, what do you do with the Adagio for strings? Thomas Larson wrote a whole book about it, and it is the great big subject to most of the world for Samuel Barber. So I guess, we could end on the question that would be posed to any biographer. What do you want to add to our understanding, or what have you succeeded in adding to our understanding of Samuel Barber so that he's not just a one-hit wonder?
Well, he isn't a one-hit wonder because there are some other works that almost have the cachet and popularity, not among the large audience that Adagio has. And that's largely because of its use in film, in Platoon, The Elephant Man, El Norte, Lorenzo's Oil. Huge exposure through the media. If other of his works had that sort of exposure, they would probably be maybe not as well known, but they would be certainly better known. So there's lots of Barber for people to really love. And for classical music, for people in the world of classical music, things like the Violin Concerto, the Piano Concerto, those are Knoxville, summer of 1915. Those are all really treasured works. Vanessa, his opera Vanessa.
And when we have and what is your predicted date when the public can grab your book and dive in?
Well, I'm hoping it looks like maybe 2022 sometime. next year.
And what will distinguish your book, and what will we learn from the book that perhaps we haven't learned yet about Barber? There's going to be a lot of categories, so I'm asking for the most surface generalization.
I feel like I've said everything that's in the book in this interview. But actually, one of the things that, and I want my book to be complementary to Barbara Heyman's, great seminal study. And one of the things that I have done is I've explored ways that Barbara's music has been used over the years, right up into our present time. Because one of the astonishing things about Barbara is how much the music is used, not only in film, and not only the adagio is used. Many other films use different music of his, but especially dance. There are ballets. Well, Martha Graham alone has 3 Barber ballets. Mark Morris has a Barber ballet. Alvin Ailey has 2 Barber ballets. Elliot Feld has a Barber ballet. Peter Martins. Christopher Wheeldon has Barber ballet.
In fact, fast forwarding to last month, Sofia Coppola, daughter of Francis Ford Coppola, directed a filmed version of a new adaptation of the Adagio for Strings with the New York City Ballet for their annual gala during the pandemic. And that was another, to a huge audience of people who admire her films. Mm-hmm. Once again, Barber's music going far and wide into the world.
Well, I'm going to have to investigate that and include something about that as well. Yeah, so that's a little bit different. Arrangements of his work. The use of, talking about the Adagio, the use in the techno rave scene of the Adagio for strings in the late 20th, early 21st century. It's an unbelievable phenomenon how all these ravers on ecstasy are like chilling out to Adagio for strings. Or there's the drum and bugle corps arrangement of Medea that went to the West End as the show Blast, and then on Broadway, and I think it's still touring. Whoever would have thought that Medea, a complex ballet score like that, would be transcribed and arranged for drum and bugle corps and be a sensational hit as such. So there's these odd byways about Barber that are kind of fun to explore. I am also looking at personal relationships. His relationship with Menotti is endlessly interesting and very, complex, to say the least. And then there are these other boyfriends over the years and what his relationship was with them and that sort of thing. There may be some new things along those lines for readers as well.
It is quite an enigma to ask not only the specific question as between Barber and Menotti, but in general, these two composers. Famously, there's a bit of this in the film as well. But the idea that Capricorn was purpose built to ensure that one composer could be on one far wing of the house and the other composer on the other far wing of the house. It's kind of symbolic of the way that they knew that they had to separate from each other in that sense. Or put another way, the competitive quality that's sort of inevitable between two people who are both brilliant composers, but also in that relationship. So did you find that it was sort of, in other words, is it impossible for two brilliant composers to have a life together? It's almost a philosophical question posed by Barber and Menotti, maybe more famously than any other example from history.
Well, I haven't done a study of that. I don't know about Robert and Clara Schumann and how that worked out. But
that's a good point.
But the relationship, it's very, very difficult to untangle. It was very deep. It was very profound. They both assisted each other enormously, influenced each other, loved each other, and yet over time, tensions arose, but they never lost sight of their love for each other and their great respect for each other. So there were complications, for sure, and eventually it led to the sale of their house. But right to the end, they were utterly devoted to each other. And so it's an interesting love story. I think John Masseri or someone had said one of the great love stories of the 20th century.
Sure.
I think that's true.
Yeah.
But it didn't work out the way Barbara hoped it would have worked out. So
Certainly.
There's some sadness there.
Certainly.
But just to mention, too, because you had mentioned before the music after Antony and Cleopatra, as you well said, there are really some wonderful scores that came after Antony and Cleopatra. That's been exaggerated, too, the slowdown in his productivity.
And among those later scores, I'd love for you to highlight some of them. So what do we have there? For example, The Lovers is a wonderful choral oratorio that feels neglected, not performed as much as it could be.
There's The Lovers, there's the song cycle Despite and Still. There are these 3 songs that he wrote for Fischer Dieskau. Really, it's just a set of 3 songs. Really quite wonderful from the early 70s. There's the 3rd essay. There are a lot of people that have admiration for that. There's the canzonetta for oboe and string orchestra, which was orchestrated by Charles Turner. And so there are some gems in those later years.
Great. Well, it was such a great opportunity to be able to talk with you on the brink of this new major addition to our understanding of the composer Samuel Barber. So thank you so much for spending the time.
Well, it was my pleasure, and kudos to you for such a fine documentary on Barber. Really, it's just wonderfully done, beautifully filmed, really very satisfying to see. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Howard.